Alrighty, thank you everyone for joining University of Atlantia's Instructor Spotlight. I will let Magistra Beatriz introduce herself.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask that everybody please turn your microphones off as well, just in case. For example, I have errant cats, so you might hear them, and I apologize. My name is Magistra Beatriz Aluares de la Hoya, and I'm from the barony of Highland Ford in the Kingdom of Atlantia, so I'm in the far northwest of our kingdom. The class that I'm presenting today is the second iteration of a course on Spanish chivalry. It was developed in response to a challenge from Olaf Linnea Fitch-Carrigan, who basically dared me to sort of step outside my comfort zone of women's history and clothing. So here we are. Most of these classes that I've been doing have been in support of the reign of our just recently stepped up king and queen, Abran and Anya the First, who were doing a 14th century Spanish reign. I had the honor of making their coronation clothes, and I've sort of appointed myself as their educational ambassador. So this class is a portion of that. I'm going to switch over real quick and get my presentation started so that I can share my screen. Wake up. All right. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see the screen.
Looking good.
No, I don't want to copy the link. Of course, now it's gonna defy me. There we go. Not a day goes by that my technology doesn't try to thwart my will, either here or at work. All right, so this class is The Fair Flowers of Spanish Chivalry, from El Cid to Don Quixote. And what we'll cover during this session is just a brief introduction to the idea, the concept of chivalry as is found in most academic literature. We'll look at the concept of Spanish chivalry and where it came from. We'll take a brief look at some chivalric literature and then discuss the decline and final gasp of Spanish chivalry in Iberia. I'll also share with you some of my primary source documents that I used, and then my contact information. So the introduction, as I said, this is the second iteration of a class that I've already taught. The first iteration of the handout is on my website, and I'll have the link to that available, or somebody will drop it in chat. You're always welcome to plunder through my website. So the concept of chivalry was pretty much an overriding social and literary concept of the Middle Ages. There were basic chivalric values that really dictated the way a knight or a mounted noble military person would behave themselves. There are some very interesting discussions of the development of a code of chivalry as a form of social control. Later, I'll tell you about a particular podcast that I listen to that addresses that very concept. But mostly, I'm going to be looking at the literary concept and sort of personal behavior. So there are three different sort of groups of values, basic chivalric values, that will come up again and again. One are the warrior values, or duty to your lord. Those include the virtues of mercy, courage, valor, fairness, and protection of the weak and the poor. So a knight is expected to be loyal to their lord, to their local, whoever their paying master is, and to display the appropriate protective instincts, protective behaviors to people who are weaker and poorer than they are. They also have a religious duty, a duty to God, and those virtues also include protecting the innocent and protecting the church and the good in general. It also includes an idea of generosity or charity. And then there's courtly love, which is the one that we're probably most familiar with through our own romantic literature, and that is a duty to a woman in specific above all, and then to all women on another layer. So this involves, that very Arthurian ideal of courtly love, gentleness, graciousness, and protection of all women. I stole these images from the Codex Manessa because they are just beautiful illustrations of these concepts. So there's this system of chivalry across Western Europe, beginning in about the 10th or 11th century, that spreads largely across England, across France. France is really the center of what we consider to be classic chivalry. You have all of the chivalric literature, and then you have authors like Froissart who are writing about the concept of chivalry and how to apply chivalrous values within a society. So they're writing manuals. But Spain is weird. España es diferente, as my Laurel used to say. Spain is different. Spain is very much cut off from Western Europe, largely because the top corner passage, land passage, is entirely composed of the Pyrenees Mountains. So this is a pretty effective barrier. And there's some very good research going on now in Iberian studies that places the Iberian Peninsula more into the Mediterranean context. So it's sort of pivoting it off of its European axis and lumping it in more with Italy and Sicily, Greece, etc., the remnants of the Roman Empire, which did not quite have what we would recognize as a code of chivalry. So how do these very Western Middle European values actually end up in Spain? Where do they come from? One idea was that they came across the strait, but we have some beautiful proof that it was actually carried across the Pyrenees in service of the Camino de Santiago. So let's take a quick look at Santiago de Compostela as some background to the development of chivalry. The cult of Santiago and the city of Santiago de Compostela is built around Santiago, St. James the Greater. And the legend of St. James the Greater is recounted in a 12th century manuscript called Historia Compostelana. The story is that St. James preached across the world, but mainly in Spain. So he brought the gospel to the Iberian Peninsula. In about 40 CE, the Virgin Mary appears to James while he is preaching at Caesar Augusta in, excuse me, on the Iberian Peninsula. James, in response to this vision, returns to Judea and carries on his preaching, but then he's executed by Herod in 44 CE for heresy, basically. And after his martyrdom, the legend says that his body was carried to Spain. It landed on the coast of Galicia and was buried at the future site of Santiago de Compostela. Now, another version of this says his body was carried to Spain, and the boat that was carrying it washes up on the shore, and there is a wedding party happening. And there's a young man who's part of the party, it doesn't say if he's the groom or what, who is riding his horse on the beach. And the horse is startled by the appearance of this boat, and it bolts into the ocean with the young man on it. Everyone thinks that they're drowned, but then they reemerge from the ocean whole and sound. It's considered the first miracle of St. James the Greater. And when they emerge from the ocean, they're covered in scallop shells. So that becomes the sacred symbol of Santiago. Now, what we do know behind this is that human remains were discovered in the area of Santiago de Compostela during the reign of Afonso II, so somewhere between 791 and 842. And Bishop Theodomir of Iria, who was a Christian Visigoth, finds these remains and declares them to be the remains of St. James the Greater. We don't know, but this begins the localized cult of Santiago. So Theodomir requisitions a chapel to be built to house the holy relics, and people begin to make pilgrimages to them. Another legend that grows up around Santiago is of Santiago Matamoros. And this lends to St. James's nickname, where the dead St. James miraculously appears to fight in a mythical Battle of Clavijo. And the Battle of Clavijo basically only exists in literature to reaffirm the existence of James, who also may or may not exist as such. But he is victorious against the Moors, and he earns the nickname Santiago Matamoros, or St. James the Moor Slayer. So this is our background for Santiago. So by the 9th century, the first routes of the pilgrimage route of the Camino de Santiago are first established. So we get our first mainly Iberian, a couple of Mediterranean, but a few pilgrims come through. And the cathedral at Santiago is the end point for the pilgrimage, and they take meticulous record of the people who complete the pilgrimage. So we know by the 10th century, French knights have arrived in the Iberian Peninsula because they have made the pilgrimage to Santiago and have signed the pilgrimage book. And these are most likely Frankish knights who came to the peninsula to protect other Christian pilgrims on their way to Santiago from the Muslim soldiers. And it's believed that this is where those chivalric concepts first start to arrive on the peninsula. They bring their literature and their values with them. Then in the 11th century, Spanish society just becomes captivated by the earliest chivalric literature coming out of Western Europe. They're really captivated by this concept of a knight of Christ, the Miles Christi. So the knight whose existence, whose service is dedicated to God at all times. And then to sort of help it along a little bit, the Knights Templar, as they start to move out of Europe and into the Iberian Peninsula, start establishing outposts along the Camino to protect pilgrims and to establish sort of a stronghold against the Moors. So this is where we first see the idea of chivalry creep into Spain. And this is one of the sort of igniting factors for adoption of chivalry as a whole. Now, all tied up in Spanish chivalry is this very sort of national identity that Spaniards have. These are some of the things that really set them apart from other forms of chivalry across Western Europe. And one of the major myths that drives the chivalric ideas of Spain is this idea of the loss of Spain, or what I'm calling the mythical legacy of the Visigoths. So the Visigoths are the ethnic groups that push the Romans effectively out of the Iberian Peninsula. They come in through the Frankish territories and the Gauls, and they sort of pick up some of the Germanics with them, and they completely take over the Iberian Peninsula. They are in the Iberian Peninsula until about 711, when the Moors conquer the peninsula, conquer all of the Iberian Peninsula, and sort of push the remnants of the Visigoths up into what become known as the northern Christian kingdoms across the top, like quarter of Spain. So the idea that sort of persists is that the Visigoths were the true Christians in Iberia. They are the true owners of the land, and they have been pushed out by the invaders. And there's this idea that the Visigothic kingdom was this one singular, united, strong Christian nation, rather than what it was, which was in reality a bunch of small kingdoms sort of clumped together. So in the 9th century is the first time we see this whole idea of both of reconquest and of a united Visigothic nation. So there are a series of historical chronicles that are written in Asturias, the prophetic chronicle, the chronicle of Albelda, and the chronicle of Alfonso III. These are requisitioned by the church and the government, by the king of Asturias, to tell the history of the Visigoths, basically. And according to this history, of course, in 711, Rodrigo, the Visigothic king, is defeated by the Muslim army, and the Muslim army destroys the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia. So the 9th century chronicles are dedicated to sort of mourning that loss of a united Gothic kingdom. You know, they create this national identity based on the Visigoths. And the kingdom of Asturias is reported to be the last of the Visigothic Christians. So they become seen as this nation that restores liberty to all Christian Iberians. They are the stronghold. So you can see how this is sort of setting up the whole idea of the Reconquista. You know, there is a natural God-given right by a group of people to own this territory. And this connection to the Visigoths sort of gets wrapped up in the chivalry. There's this notion of continuity between Asturias and the old Visigothic kingdom that really influences, like I said, the Reconquest and influences the sort of knightly class. It becomes repeated through subsequent centuries. And I, as an academic, am compelled to point out that there's absolutely no historical record or archaeological record that shows that the Visigoths were connected in any way to all of the people who claim that they're connected to the Visigoths. So, for example, Alfonso VI of Leon y Castile is said to be descended from illustrious Gothic lineage. And this is what gives him his claim to his throne. Much the same was said about Alfonso the 11th. He was said to be descended from the Goths. Enrique de Trastamara derives his whole right of kingship over his brother Pedro via a link to the Visigoths. And then even the new kingdoms, as they are born of Portugal, Aragon, Catalonia, and Navarre, are legitimizing their very existence through a link to this sort of imaginary Visigothic kingdom. And the knightly class counts its nobility as its link to the Visigoths. So it all goes back to who were the original people here, who were the first, who have the better claim. And this rolls us right into the Reconquista, conquest and crusade. So Pope Urban II, in a letter to the King of Aragon, who was inquiring if his knights may go on crusade to Jerusalem, one of his quotes says, "It is no virtue to rescue Christians from the Saracens in one place, only to expose them to the tyranny and oppression of the Saracens in another." Spanish knights were forbidden from going on crusade to the Holy Kingdom. So Sancho I Ramirez, King of Aragon, basically firmly believed that the liberation of his kingdom of Aragon, only following the destruction and expulsion of the Moors, would lead to a recovery of this old Visigothic kingdom and a regrowth of Christianity. So it was commonly believed throughout the northern Christian kingdoms that the Moors had no right to claim the lands that they did in Iberia. So they are there basically illegally. So these lands were once Christian, and they're now held unjustly. And that concept of just and unjust forms the basis, the foundation for arguments for wars of conquest from the Reconquista all the way through to the Conquistadores. We'll talk about them towards the end. So this widespread belief, it trickles down to the average people, and it's actively influenced by the popes through the 11th and 12th century. We have a wonderful print on the right-hand side from one of Alfonso's books, Alfonso the El Sabio, of a Christian and a Moor exchanging an embrace before one of the great battles of their armies. So crusade, the definition that I'm working with, the short and sweet definition, is an indulgenced holy war. So it is a war that's declared by a religious leader such as a pope, and the the Pope has the ability to grant indulgences to those who participate in that war. In other words, they can grant absolution of sin, they can remove the need for penance for sin, they can guarantee immortal life. And then there's sort of a side benefit of generally, according to Spanish custom of warfare, if you were involved in a just war against an infidel, you are allowed to, once you kill or enslave them, first of all, you're allowed to kill or enslave them. Second of all, you're allowed to take all their stuff. So you get all of their property too. So it just so happens that you can get pretty wealthy in a crusade. So Pope Alexander II, who was on the papal throne from 1062 to 1073, really encouraged French knights to go on expedition into Spain. I believe it's Froissart that says that if a knight wishes to learn the arts of tournament, he goes to France. If a knight wishes to learn the art of war, he goes to Spain. So Alexander is pushing French knights into Spain, and he's framing it as a crusade before the first crusade ever happens. So in 1063, he issues a papal bull that instructs knights that are already on a journey to Spain to stop and confess, and they'll receive remission of their sins. So they will receive an indulgence of relief from penance and absolution of their sins, which directly equates the war in Spain with the Crusades in the Holy Land. So the idea, to relate it back to Urban's quote earlier, is that why should you go to Jerusalem to fight Muslims when there are Muslims right here at home? There's no more virtue in going to the Holy Land than there is in going to Castile and driving out the Moors. So Gregory VII, who was on the throne from 1073 to 1085, sort of carried out this Spanish crusade, as it's colloquially known, but he was really more concerned with making sure that the church retained all of the rights they possibly could in Spain. And then we hit Urban II, who is promising and handing out indulgences right to left, as long as they're staying in Iberia and not traveling to Jerusalem. So this layers on top of those chivalric values already. It layers on top of that idea of the Visigothic line being entitled to the Iberian Peninsula. So you have all of that wrapped up in the chivalric code. And then you have the growth of Spanish military orders. And when we think about the concept of warrior monks or holy monks, we think of the Templars, the Hospitallers, etc., the big orders who were out in Acre and out in the Holy Lands. And the Spanish military orders in large part grew out of those bigger organizations and worked alongside of them, and sometimes were reincorporated back into them. So let's take a look at some of these brotherhoods, because there are a few that exist still as awards, basically. So the oldest is the Order of Calatrava, and it's the first military order founded in Castile, and it was named for the fortress of Calatrava, or Calatrava, which was taken from the Moors in 1147. It was founded by decree of Pope Alexander III in September of 1164, and its specific purpose was to defend the southern borders of Castile. So by this time, the northern Christian kingdoms are starting to push down and starting to push the kingdom of Al-Andalus further and further south, until eventually it is just the Nasrid Empire of Granada sort of clinging to the southern edge of the Iberian Peninsula. And this is the whole process. We don't really know where their seat of worship was exactly. A lot of them worshipped at the Cathedral of Calatrava, but their religious rule were Cistercians. So they are Cistercian monks technically. And their livery would be a white Cistercian mantle with the Red Cross of Calatrava. So if you're from Calontir or have spent any time in Calontir, you're going to recognize the Cross of Calatrava. The second oldest order is the Order of Santiago, which is, of course, named for St. James the Greater of Compostela. And it was founded in the 12th century to basically help everybody evict the Moors from Spain. Pretty much the whole driving oeuvre of these groups is to push the Moors out as efficiently as possible. To the far right is an image of Santiago wearing the robes of the Order of Santiago, which is the Santiago cross, the sword cross. Their seat of worship is at the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, and they are Augustinian. And the Augustinians tended to be a little more loosey-goosey than the Cistercians. The Cistercians were known for being pretty tough, pretty focused on that whole chastity thing. And the Augustinians were a little less strict. Okay, and then there's the Order of Alcantara, and I do apologize. A couple of the pictures I had to pull from later than I would have liked, just to get pictures of the livery actually on people, but you can just barely see that he's wearing his Order of Alcantara pendant, although it's not colored. Alcantara was named for a city that was retaken from the Moors by King Alfonso XI of Leon in 1214. So it was founded in 1166 and then confirmed by Pope Alexander. So Pope Alexander is really busy in Spain confirming all of these religious military orders. And once again, their purpose was the defense of the borders and specifically to support the Castilian Knights of Calatrava. So they spun off of Calatrava, which is why they have the same badge. Their seat of worship is in Valentia at Alcantara. They're also Cistercian, and they're closely affiliated with the Order of Calatrava and were folded back into them when their order was dissolved in the 14th century. And then there's the Order of Montesa, which is a really fascinating double badge. It's got the standard equal armed cross over the cross of Calatrava. So they originally started as a detachment of Templars, and this group of Templars had come into Spain to help defend Aragon and Castile from the Moors, and King Alfonso I basically granted them a large chunk of land around Montesa, and they spun off a group who stayed in Spain after the original group of Templars left. So they were named for St. George of Montesa. Just to draw your attention to it, the person wearing the Montesa badge is actually in the lower right-hand corner. It's that monk. You can't really see the gray cross of Calatrava in this, but you can see the red. And they were there to defend the frontier against Moors and pirates. They were the only military order who was allowed to undertake ocean warfare. So they were often deployed against the Muslim Navy. Seat of worship at Montesa, another Valencia. They're also Cistercian, and they were also folded back into the Order of Calatrava, who was sort of their parent organization. I skipped a whole bunch. There's 6 or 7 more minor groups, but I did just want to bring up one really unusual one, that is the Order of the Hatchet. And the Order of the Hatchet was a sort of a singular group of people who received it for a singular incident and was immediately closed. But it is the only all-women's military order in Spanish history. And it was given to the women of a town who, when all of the men of the city had been killed defending the city against the Moors, put on their husband's clothes and took up farm implements and successfully defended the city. So every woman who participated in the defense was awarded the Order of the Hatchet, and then it was immediately closed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about chivalric literature. We're going to start with El Cid. El Cid, of course, an actual person, an actual knight, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, who lived from 1043 to 1099 in Castile. He was a knight and a warlord, and he participated in battles all across Iberia. He gained a huge amount of property in the ensuing time. He was granted the Arabic honorific, and I know that Tala's here, and she's probably going to cringe, but I'm going to try El Cid, the Lord, El Campeador, the champion. So he was the champion of God, effectively. And he is one of the great influences on the very nationalistic character of Spanish chivalry. He fought with both Christian and Muslim armies, depending on sometimes on pay, sometimes on the justness of the cause. But he's known for reclaiming the Taifa. For those who didn't get to go through any of my history of 14th century Spain, the Taifa kingdoms are what remains as the Empire of Al-Andalus starts to break down. It happens over two different phases throughout Spanish history, and they basically collapse into separate city-states. And each Taifa has its own warlord or its own emir, and they eventually, come back together, and then the government will fall apart and they'll reform again, and then they reform back into Al-Andalus just in time to be driven down into Granada. So one of the things that El Cid did was reclaim the Taifa of Valencia from the Moors during the Reconquista. So he's actually he's gifted Valencia by the King of Castile, and he rules as the Prince of Valencia from 1094 to 1099. And he is, I would say, probably the greatest national hero of Spain. He's absolutely legendary for his adherence to the traditional knightly virtues, and his prowess in battle really got him to that point. He is well known as a Moor slayer. From the image on the left, he is the gentleman in the armor on the right who is not currently having his head chopped off. But you can still find statues of El Cid. You can still buy copies of El Cid. There's a really terrible dramatic adaptation on Netflix. I don't recommend it for anything other than entertainment purposes, but it's fairly easy to familiarize yourself with the book. Now, another extraordinarily popular piece of chivalric literature were the Chronicles of Amadís de Gaula. Amadís is entirely fictional, but he is a young man who is born in a fictional land to a pair of star-crossed lovers, and his mother has to give him up for adoption in a story that sounds very much like the relinquishing of Moses. She puts him into a basket and puts him into the river, and he's found by another family, and he has these great adventures all over his imaginary land. He woos beautiful women. He falls irrevocably in love with a woman. He nearly dies a tragic death for want of her love before she comes around, and he fights Saracens and monsters, and just travels everywhere. There are 9 or 10 volumes in the Amadís de Gaula series before there was such a thing as a book series. So they run off a whole bunch of sequels, and Amadís has a huge influence on the knights of the 13th century. He's seen and described as courteous and gentle and sensitive, and he's a Christian, and he defends free love, to put it in 1960s America term. He is a handsome man who would and does cry if his lady refuses him. He falls, in fact, into a deep and terrible depression, and can't get up until she agrees to let him court her. But he's invincible in battle, and he usually emerges drenched in his own and his opponent's blood. So this is the picture of Spanish knighthood. So all of the best qualities of both a courtier and a warrior at the same time. He's probably the most representative Iberian hero of chivalric romance. He is really the character of chivalric Spain, and he goes on and is very, I say he goes on like he's a real person, but his books go on to be very influential among the conquistadors. Del Castillo mentions all of the wonders that Amadís sees in his travels when he first arrives at Tenochtitlan. And then the place names throughout the New World, like California, come directly from Amadís de Gaula. So we've found copies and inventories of Amadís being carried to the New World in the belongings of conquistadors. And then the third piece of chivalric literature that I'm going to talk about in this section is not a set of stories. It's not a chivalric romance, but it is a manual by Ramon Lull. And I have to give a shout out of credit. Sir Bryce de Byram of Atlantia actually took my class at university and suggested that I add this section in after I just dropped a mention of Lull's book. So Ramon Lull was a self-educated peasant craftsman who becomes a monk after an ecstatic vision of the Virgin Mary. And one of the projects that Lull dedicates himself to is writing this work, the Book of the Order of Chivalry, or the Book of Knights and Chivalry. It depends on how the translator chooses to put it. And he wrote this work between 1274 and 1276. And his real purpose is to reform the concept of knighthood, because by the 13th century, the way Ramon Lull sees it is that the knights have sort of moved away from what their original purpose is. They've become wealthy, they've become very politically powerful, and they're not really keeping up what their image and their role is. So the Order of Chivalry becomes this text, and it is now for academics a classic text for understanding medieval knighthood as a whole. So according to Lull, knights had two places, at home and abroad. So at home, they're expected to be warriors and judges, and their whole job is to maintain order within the society. Like, they're nobles, they've been elevated to this position, they hold a special rule or a special remit. Now, abroad, their whole job is to unite under one banner of God against the infidels. So twofold purpose, maintaining order at home and fighting against the infidel abroad. And this book is actually incredibly popular. It runs to many printings. It spreads all the way across Iberia and up into Western Europe. It's reprinted. Of course, you can still get reprints now, but it's reprinted regularly well into the 19th century. So it sort of never loses its popularity. Now, the whole concept of Spanish chivalry basically really lasts until the end of the Reconquista, and then it begins this interesting and sort of slow decline. And according to Lord Byron, the death of Spanish chivalry can be placed squarely on Cervantes' shoulder. He says in one of his infamous poems, Cervantes smiled Spain's chivalry away. A single laugh demolished the right arm of his country. But that's not necessarily really the opinion that's held by most medieval scholars today. So there's a couple of theories on what happened, on how Spanish chivalry comes to an end. One, of course, it's all Don Quixote's fault. The second says it's probably the final expulsion of the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. And then other people say, well, no, it's the centralization of political power. And I'm taking it may be, an overly moderate stance, but I'm thinking that the last two really had the most to do with it. It's probably a small combination of all of these things. And the expulsion of the Moors, the loss of that enemy at home, I think is going to be one of the major ones. To your left, you'll actually see the sort of bobadil that was surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella at the fall of Granada. So on January 2nd, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella have led the Christian armies of Iberia against the stronghold of Granada. They've been under an 8-month siege by the Christian armies, and Granada finally capitulates and Bobadil surrenders. And then in 1493, so he sort of stays on and attempts to live in this new world that he finds himself in. But in 1493, he just abandons Granada as a project altogether, returns to Morocco, and dies like 40 years later. So he lives out the rest of his life in sort of peaceful obsolescence. And then there is one last real push to maintain the Moorish presence. And that's the first rebellion of the Alpujarras from 1499 to 1501. And it is a group of Moors who have been living under Christian rule. They've been living up to the terms of the Treaty of Granada, which was actually surprisingly generous, not exactly what we would call generous, but more generous than might be expected after a generation of warfare, several generations. So this group of rebels rise up against the Christian rule, and Ferdinand and Isabella Ferdinand and Isabella's and descendants immediately terminate the Treaty of Granada. So they end all Muslim rights in the kingdom, and they tell all of the Moors that still remain, you have a choice. You can either convert to Christianity, you can get out now, or you can die. And they give them a very short amount of time to do that in. So by the end of 1492, but by 1501 at the latest, this enemy at home is gone. And the religious aspect of the Reconquista has been completed, and really the territorial aspect has been completed. So at this point, it sort of becomes, well, what is a warrior knight to do when there's no one left to fight? And then at the same time, we also have this problem of the centralization of power in Iberia. So Ferdinand and Isabella are really struggling to unite Castile-Aragon and sort of establish a single source of all political power. And the problem with the military orders of knighthood is that they are immensely powerful, wealthy, and hold a lot of territory and a lot of sway in Iberia. And they are a direct threat to royal rule. Many of them answer to the head of their order rather than to the local or the national government. Then the head of the order answers directly to the church. And while Ferdinand and Isabella also answer directly to the church, they really don't want to kind of share that position with anybody. So what eventually happens is that many of the orders are disbanded. Some of them are stripped of their power or their territories. Some of them are folded back into parent organizations. And then the others that sort of capitulated in some way are very much left alone. So we come to the question, well, what about Don Quixote? And I sort of stand with contemporary academics who say that really, the thing that Don Quixote represents it is kind of twofold. It is a tragic story of Spanish knighthood. You have this aging knight who is largely delusional, who has been filling his head with chivalric romances, and he longs for one more great adventure. So he sort of press gangs his servant into going with him. And he sets out on all of these adventures that are largely the product of his own delusions. And in the end, he's sort of broken down and tired, and he is brought back home, and his friends put him back to bed in his home, and he's sort of handed his chivalric romances in front of the fire. And for a lot of Spanish at the time, this was the fate of their national character. Like, they're seeing what it means to be a Spanish knight, what it means to be Spanish, almost literally put out to pasture. It has become old and tired and ridiculous. And it's largely become ridiculous because of the new ideas of Renaissance humanism that are entering Spain. According to one Iberian scholar, Demate, he says that Cervantes declared that his aim was to put an end to a genre that most critics of the time condemned because it was believed to represent a primary source of distraction from good behavior, not just for noble gentlemen and ladies, but also for the general public. So it was very much sort of like the attitude towards reading novels in the 18th and 19th century. Novels, she's read too many books and they've turned her head. Sort of thing. But they're also seen as just sort of distracting and childish and a little old-fashioned and kind of silly. We should be reading better literature than this. And there's a really interesting strain of thought that I've been sort of turning over in my head for a while, that what Cervantes is doing is not kicking off the decline of chivalry, but he's documenting the end of a process that started in the 15th century with the end of the Reconquista. So he's looking at, almost 200 years of decline at this point, not starting another 100 years or so. So I think the argument that it's more credited to the shifting political and religious landscape in Iberia is really a lot more to blame than a single author. Although, Cervantes probably helped the decline along a little bit. And then we have one moment where chivalry tries to give one last gasp for life, in a very sort of cockeyed sort of way. And that's with the conquistadors in the New World. Bernal Diaz de Castillo is famous for saying, "We came here to serve God and the king, and also to get rich." So this sort of encapsulates a little bit of their influence from chivalry, but the reality of their situation. As part of the conquest of the New World, the conquistadors were given mandates by the Pope and the King to, basically convert as many of the natives as they could possibly find and to acquire goods and lands, because it's their natural right as Christians. They would often land on the shore of a new land, read out a proclamation in Spanish that says to all of the native people gathered, this land now belongs to the Crown of Spain. You are now Spanish citizens, etc. The problem being that they read it in Spanish and the natives didn't speak Spanish yet. So there's a conquest division where the Spanish forays into the New World are really driven by a desire to acquire lands and goods, but it has that natural right element. And then there's also the duty of conversion. And there's this fun little loophole in this where if a native refuses conversion, it's seen as refusing cooperation with the new Spanish lords, which is perpetrating an act of war, which then justifies either killing or enslaving them all and taking all of their stuff. So it's a lot of the same tactics that you see in the Reconquista. In fact, the encomiendo system that's transported from Iberia into the New World, in which they have these giant plantations and the local natives are forced to work on it for pay, which was not usually very much, under the watchful eye of a Spanish lord, was actually first deployed by many of the combat knights in the Reconquista, who were then granted land, and they would enslave Muslims to work on their property as well. So you see kind of those ideas that grew up during the Reconquista, during the Spanish Crusade, among the knightly class, tilted a little to the violent side, even more so than normal. And this is often seen as the sort of last emergence of chivalric ideals. All right, I'm going to show you some of my resources. Of course, Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes Saavedra. If you look this up on my website, I have links to as many free copies as I could find. So Ramon Lull's Book of the Order of Chivalry is available through JSTOR or online through Amazon. AMADÍS de GAULA is available for free online, as is The Lay of the Cid, the poem of El Cid, at sacredtexts.com. So this is me. My website is SpanishSeamstress.com. I have a Facebook page that is also Spanish Seamstress. You guys are always welcome to contact me at any time. I'm adding more stuff to my website as we speak, and I'm starting to ponder the next iteration of this class, which will probably be the influence of Muslim ideas on the concept of Western chivalry. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if we want to stop recording, Holly, we can go ahead and have a question and answer session.